I have a confession to make, and I do hope you won't judge me too harshly for it, but here goes. I don't know much about Chinatown. Well, at least I didn't before starting this project. You see, I was born in Calgary and spent most of my childhood in the suburbs, meaning that my exposure to Chinatown was mostly limited to trips to Dragon City Mall after piano lessons and family gatherings over dim sum on Sunday afternoons. But for the people who grew up in the neighborhood, and increasingly for me now as an adult, Chinatown is about more than just restaurants and boutique DVD shops. But a lot of the time I find it really difficult explaining why I care about Chinatown, especially to people who don't have a similar history or relationship with the community that I do. And in the quest to better find an answer to this question, I thought it was important to get a sense of just how we got here in the first place, collecting and sharing stories from Calgary's Chinatown. I was able to have some really interesting conversations about where we came from, where we are now, and where we could be in the future. I hope that this helps serve you in connecting with your own cultural roots, whatever they might be, and in better appreciating one of Calgary's most interesting and diverse neighborhoods from the perspective of a Calgarian born Chinese. Before it was Calgary, this land was known as Elbow, which makes sense once you start to see how the Bow River intersects with the Elbow River in a 90-degree corner, connecting two major freshwater rivers in southern Alberta. This was also considered a strategic position by the Canadian government, who established a Northwest Mounted Police Fort here in 1875 that served multiple purposes. The first was to cut off American bootleggers from getting at our lucrative rye whiskey, as well as to establish relationships with the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Stoney Nakoda, and Tsuut'ina nations. Treaty 7 was signed in 1877 as a result, and 130,000 square kilometers of land between Red Deer and the U.S. border, including Calgary, became the eminent domain of the newly minted settler government. Now, one of the fun facts, at least in my opinion, about Canada is that the Vikings beat Jean Cabot to the punch by becoming the first Europeans to land on the Atlantic coast, somewhere around the 10th century. And I remember getting a similar feeling when I first learned about Chinese people, having lived in Calgary since 1885, 10 years before it became a city. But in the greater context of Chinese-Canadian history, the Canadian Pacific Railway was completed in 1885, which is helpful context to have when you start to see Chinese laborers beginning to disperse outside of the Pacific coast and moving into the prairies for new opportunities. As it turns out, past Canadians weren't as accepting of diversity as compared to present-day Canadians, and John A. Macdonald was nothing if not a man of the people, and so a federal head tax was implemented to reduce immigration counts, specifically from China. Those that remained were made to live in segregated ethnic communities, also known as Chinatowns. I spoke with Ronald Lee, whose family roots date back to this period in Canadian history.
My name is Ronald Lee. I was born in Lethbridge. I'm a third generation Chinese Canadian. My grandfather came here in 1905 from Guangdong province, Guangdong province in the county of Toi San. And he worked on the railroad originally, and on one of his trips to through Alberta, they started in Vancouver, through the BC interior, went to Edmonton, down to Calgary, Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, and then the train turned around and went back. But on his first stop, when he came to Alberta, they stopped in Lethbridge, Alberta, and he stepped off the train and he looked around and there was nobody around. It was a barren little town, Lethbridge, and he said to himself, when I'm finished working on the railroad, I'll come back to Lethbridge and start a business because there are no Chinese people here and there's no competition. And his first job was, he came after the completion of the railroad, but his job was a grease monkey on the train. So at every whistle stop, he would have to get out where the train stopped to refuel for coal and water, and he would have to crawl between the wheels of the engine, the cow catch or whatever, and grease all of the wheels as well as the carriage cars. And he had to work what they got paid 1 month after. He had to work 1 month before he got paid, and they were actually paid half the amount of a white Caucasian. And I remember my grandfather saying that he got his first paycheck, and he went across the street in Vancouver to a restaurant, and he says, "I'm going to treat myself to a good meal, my first meal in Canada." I remember he had $30, and he hung his jacket up on a coat hook and sat at the restaurant bar. Those restaurants would have those little stools, right, a long countertop. And he told me, he says, he said to the restaurant owner, cafe owner, he said, "I want your best meal. Tell me, what's your best meal?" And the best meal cost, I think it was $1.25, and it was steak and eggs, toast, coffee. And he says, and I took the first bite. He says, and it was so good. He said, it was my first real meal in Canada. He says, and I really enjoyed it. And then he went to go pay for his meal. He went to his coat on the coat hook, and there was someone in the restaurant watching him, and that person had stolen his wallet. So he went to pay for it, and he had no money. And he said to the cafe owner, I don't have any money. Someone stole my money. And the cafe owner said, well, you're still going to have to pay for it. He says, so that night, he said, I spent another 10 hours washing dishes to pay for my meal. And those are neat stories that you hear of Chinese immigrants that came to this country, and lessons to learn.
I also asked Ronald about the origins of Chinatowns in Canada.
Back in China, where most of the first wave of Chinese came from, they came from Guangdong province, and there were 4 counties. There was Sunway, Toisan, Hoiping, and Anping. Those were the 4 counties. I have to say with a lot of pride when you think of what our first ancestors had to do to survive. Remember, they had no civil rights or citizenship rights in Canada. Sir John A. Macdonald, in the government documents, describes the Chinese as sojourners. That's the term he gave them. Sojourners, a foreigner who comes to this country who has no intention of wanting to be part of Canada and will go back when their job is finished. Right? That's the type of ideology that the Chinese were fighting. They were brought in as indentured workers. Right? When they were building the Canadian National Railroad here, they were short of laborers to build this. In building the the National Railroad, they had a lot of Irish immigrant workers, but they couldn't get enough Irish immigrants. And there was a English contractor named Andrew Onderdonk says, well, I can get you some Chinese workers, and if we can't get enough, Irish workers. And he said, well, how do you do that? He says, give me the contract. Just give me the big contract to bring in laborers, and I will get it for you. And so the government gave him the big contract, right, to bring it. And he went back to Guangdong province, the 4 counties, of where the, Toisan, Sunway, Hoiping, and Anping. And he had this big advertisement. He advertised it, right? Come to Canada, right? And I will pay you to be a work. You'll get wages, and and they had to sign an indentured contract, right? For 10 years, whatever. And when your contract is fulfilled, I will pay for your way back home to China. So he recruited 18,000 Chinese workers to do the section in British Columbia, right? And when it was finished, Andrew Onderdock said, "You know about that passage back to China? I lied. I'm not giving you anything." So they were forced. So the Chinese workers that were able for somehow to save enough money for their own passage went back to China, but the majority had to migrate and find different jobs, as houseboys, farm workers, all in the service industry, because the government passed legislation that the Chinese could not belong to any, we call it professional jobs, such as a lawyer, doctor, engineer. That was by law. They were prohibited to actually trying to get educated for that job or having a position of that job. During this time from 1890, right? 1890 is when after the completion of the railroad, the Chinatowns started to appear in the different major cities, and the Chinatowns were basically an enclave where the Chinese people could survive, because they could not survive in other neighborhoods because they weren't allowed to be in other neighborhoods. And I guess you would call this a ghetto, right?
Calgary's Chinatown hasn't always existed where it stands today, though. The first Chinatown consisted of a few laundries, which, just as a brief side note, was a really common occupation for quite a few reasons, a couple being that startup costs were quite low, and you didn't need to speak a lot of English to get by. So from a historical perspective, it was really neat to see the Chinese family and everything everywhere all at once running a laundromat. But movie trivia aside, the first Chinatown in Calgary was centered around this spot along Stephen Avenue back in 1888. By the early 1900s, a second Chinatown was built to accommodate the growing number of Chinese occupants in the city, and this Chinatown was located between 10th and 11th Avenues, which is now home to this rooftop park in the Beltline community. Between the two Chinatowns, there were 500 Chinese Calgarians, mostly involved in the restaurant and laundry businesses. I don't really know how else to describe this other than the universe having a somewhat perverse sense of humor, but in 1910, the Canadian National Railway planned an extension into Calgary. The proposed site? You guessed it, Chinatown. Landowners sold the property and evicted the Chinese tenants, who were then forced to relocate. Alice Lam is a prominent Chinatown community advocate, as well as a volunteer coordinator extraordinaire.
So I was born and raised in Calgary, Chinatown, and my parents were refugees from Vietnam, but ethnically were Chinese. We grew up in the Chinatown of Saigon in Vietnam, and I was born here in 1988 during the Olympics, which was a great time for my parents to come because there was a lot of work for immigrants. So my mom and dad's first job was working at the Sun Ice factory sewing snow coats for the '88 Winter Olympics. We really didn't know a lot of people in Chinatown, but luckily my parents were a part of the Christian faith community, so they actually had a church in Forest Lawn that they went to, which was made up of other Chinese Vietnamese refugees. Through that neighborhood, we were introduced to Chinatown, where we found one of our first apartments to live in a subsidized housing building. I later on went to go to Chinese school in Chinatown, and then as an adult, I volunteer and lead historic Chinatown tours.
I asked Alice how she describes the history of Calgary's Chinatown, having moved multiple times before settling into where it is today.
When I first came into Chinatown and started learning about the history, I had no idea that this was our third Chinatown. The first one was in the back of basically where City Hall is right now. The second one was really close to the train tracks, and both times, due to racism and due to speculative real estate development, both communities were kicked out. And finally, a group of Chinese pioneers said, you know what, enough is enough. We want to make sure that we never get kicked out of a place again, because it was really hard during that time for Chinese to find places to live and to find jobs. And so for people who had been in the community for a generation or for more time and had made up some savings, they decided to pool their money together and buy their first building, which would make up Canton Block today. If it wasn't for this, Chinatown today would not exist as it is. And it didn't just come naturally. Like, they didn't get to just go and buy a piece of land and get a building permit. They really had to fight for it, because there were a lot of people in Calgary adamantly against Chinatown forming in this neighborhood. They didn't want Chinese people to live in their backyards. They suggested that they go over by the Ogden area, over by Ramsey or Inglewood, somewhere far away, because they saw the Chinese community as an eyesore. They saw them as an unclean kind of community. These are words that you can see in newspaper clippings from the time, even today, and you could see kind of how rampant racism was and how overt it was. And so during the tour, we really kind of walked through the neighborhood in terms of where the first building started, where it started to grow. We tried to describe what the neighborhood looked like. Like, before we had all these apartment buildings, Chinatown was really made up of single family homes, 2-story homes that people would use for gathering space on the main floor and housing on the second floor. Nowadays, you see these Edwardian 2-story buildings that are kind of rectangle, and basically they're made up of restaurants that help with the rent on the main floor, and then the association is on the second floor.
Green spaces are at kind of a premium in downtown, so it's pretty common for the Chinese community living in Chinatown to spend a lot of time in this park. I used to work downtown pretty close to here myself and spent a lot of my lunch times in this park, which is just kitty corner from Chinatown. It's not technically part of Chinatown, but it's a pretty major fixture for the Chinese Calgarian community, who use the parkade to access the community during the weekends, and you'll oftentimes find elders just chatting or playing chess. Well, at least when it's warmer out, you'll have to take my word for it. But anyways, like Alice was talking about, when the Canadian National Railway was expanding into Calgary, there was quite a lot of talk about where the Chinese community should end up. And it was sort of like the 1910s version of NIMBYism, where no one wanted to be caught with the, proverbial hot potato of a Chinese ethnic community in their backyard. But one of the biggest NIMBYs, let's call them, was Alderman James Short, who's quoted at the time having compared the relocation issue to setting up an isolation hospital to quarantine and contain the spread of a contagious disease. Up until early November 2022, this park's name was James Short Park. With newfound autonomy and the financial means to back it up, Chinatown began to develop the neighborhood into a space that wasn't just homes and businesses, but also schools, community centers, and churches. Many early Chinese Calgarians formed and became members of benevolent associations, and these were a form of mutual aid organization that took in newcomers and advocated to the greater city on behalf of its members on issues that directly affected them.
In China, they would have different community groups to look after each other, and they were actually known as triads. And a benevolent association could be a triad, but a triad didn't necessarily could be a benevolent association. And most people think of triads as being gangs or criminal gangs, and there were certain triads. And a triad is based on 3 things: heaven, earth, and man. And it was a brotherhood to protect yourself against other outside forces. It was a means of protecting your group. And but when the Chinese came to Canada, when they first came to Canada, they formed triads to protect themselves. And there were different types of triads. There was the Fong, which was used as a mail drop, a headquarters. And so when Chinese came, they would go to the Fong and they would register themselves. And they would have their address in China, and they would also give the address where they would be in Canada. So wherever they were in Canada, they would write any letter or communication to the headquarters, and the headquarters would forward it back to their village in China. and vice versa. If they had to send money back, communication, that was their kind of post office and a meeting place for newcomers. Then there was the Benevolent Association, which were associations formed by Chinese groups with the same surname that came from the same county. Like there would be a Li Association, a Wong Association. And so there would be like the headquarters association. There was the Benevolent Association. There was another association called a Mutual Aid Association where the Chinese would pool their money, and it was like a co-op where they could lend money to each other to start businesses. And then there was the Secret Society. This was the political society which donated money to Sun Yat-sen to overthrow the Qing dynasty. And a Chinese person could belong to all four associations.
Can you speak to how many there were, like just to get a scope for how big this institution was and where the Li Association fits into the picture?
Okay, there's I don't know how many associations there are now, but what would happen sometimes when an association would be created, sometimes there would be what do you call it, egos, conflict. Like I want to be president, I want to be chairman, right? And so quite often, sometimes you would have a Li Association, and there might be somebody that would split off and create their own association. And for example, there's a Taiwanese association which is composed of Lis, and they would have their own association. So there could be quite a number of them. And actually in Calgary, the oldest association was the Wong Association. And then the next oldest one was the Li Association. The Li Association in Calgary was formed in 1905, and it still exists today.
A decade later, the Canadian government reached the sound conclusion that the head tax wasn't a strong enough deterrent keeping Chinese people out of Canada, and this is when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1923. It was eventually repealed 24 years later, but by this point Chinatown was already in another period of transition. Chinese Calgarians were beginning to move into the suburbs, while newcomers were increasingly immigrating from areas outside of the original four counties, bringing with them their own languages and cultural norms, which shifted the demographics of the neighborhood in pretty significant ways. Chinatown was experiencing a lot of stress during this period, and its existence moving forward wasn't guaranteed.